Man, I'm so excited about today's podcast. I've been a follower of this gentleman on his social media, and he can be a bit of a shit disturber on social media. But I admire his courage. I admire how he takes a stand and how he always backs it up with logic. And he's also the program director and the morning show host at 92.9 The Bull in Saskatoon, which is, of course, one of the most prolific radio stations, especially in the country space in Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, Pat Dubois.
Jim Cressman, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure, man. So I like to start generally with giving people an idea of where you come from and the origin story, the backstory. So let's talk a little bit about how you forged your place to get into this crazy radio game.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to be at first. I didn't want to be in radio. It was one of those things growing up with my father being, as a kid, he was the morning show host and the program director of CJWW, where we look at it as our big sister station. But it was tough. And as a teenager, I remember thinking to myself, the last thing I want to do is get into radio because I was a rebellious teenager. I didn't find the music at the time cool and none of that. And then eventually what happened was, and this is kind of weird.
What kind of music were you into as a teenager? This is always so interesting for me.
I was more of a hip hop fan, actually, when I was because I was a teenager in like the early 2000s, and so hip hop at the time was taking a much more production based turn with like Timbaland and Pharrell and the producers almost having as much clout as the artists. And being a suburban white kid from Saskatoon, I can relate a bit more to the things that were being like done from a musical standpoint and not so much the lyrical content. So I just dove headfirst into that.
Right. Okay. And then continue on with your origin story. But I think this is so interesting and we'll circle back to it. But there's been a lot of hip hop infusion in country music now, which might explain your affinity for the format as you've grown and developed alongside it.
Absolutely. That is, from hip hop, pop, everything like that. I find that I love that turn that country music has taken in the last, I guess we'll say decade or so, but like I said, we can get to that later if you like. As far as the beginning, it was take a kid to work day when I was in ninth grade. I don't know if they do that everywhere in every high school around Canada, but for me, it was that. And I had been to, the radio station dozens and dozens of times growing up because, my father, Vic, worked there. But this was the official day where I kind of was, I wasn't even Vic's son. I was just a student coming in to learn about the various aspects of what it takes to run a radio station. Because I had only really seen the on-air part, the manager's office is upstairs. So I didn't really know much about sales, creative, production, things like that. And so I went from department to department and I ended up actually falling in love with production, the commercial production. I found that to be, I'm a big nerd. I'm a big computer nerd, software. I was always the one who wanted to get on the computers growing up and everything for like, not immature reasons. So when I saw how audio was manipulated in a multi-track program, whether it was Pro Tools or whether it was Adobe Audition, I immediately fell in love with that. And so when I was done that Take a Kid to Work day, I remember, and my father will still tell me this, is that I never stopped talking about production. And so I still didn't want to be in radio though. I maybe wanted to do music. And then what happened was after high school, I needed a part-time job in the summer while I kind of figured out what I was doing in life. And so they ended up giving me a part-time job, do a sort of part-time producer. I would do the, I don't know what the language rules are here, but I would do the bitch work essentially. I was just there for the boss of that department to just leave me scraps to kind of do at the end of the day part-time. And I fell in love with that even more. I found myself staying extra long to not only do the commercials that were set for me, but to do like a spec spot for a company that I just made up in my head.
That might be the indicator when you've got the right career choice. The time just flies by and you don't even notice that an hour's gone by on the clock. You're just having so much fun.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing when people get lost in a book or a movie or a video game or whatever their art of choice is. I was finding that same satisfaction from doing that. And that's when I realized that that's something that I could definitely do as a career. And so about A couple months after that, one of our two producers, full-time producers, actually quit to go tour with his band called the Deep Dark Woods. They even played Bonnaroo at one point. Apparently, they had a little successful run, and he was sort of my teacher, my mentor in that department. And so the company basically decided they offered me the job. They were like, "Do you want to do this full time?" And I didn't know what I wanted to do as a career quite yet. I knew I wasn't really super keen on university because I couldn't decide on something, and I didn't want to waste my own money or the money of my family on, just getting a degree to get a degree. I wanted to do something that I knew that I'd be passionate in. And so I started working full time in production, and it worked out great. I had a lot of fun with it. I did that for about 4 years, from about 3 years, 2005 to about midway through 2007. And that's when they decided in our company, because at that point we had 3 radio stations: CJWW, Country 600, the big boy in this province, Hot 93 at the time, and Magic 98.3. Hot 93 was our modern country station.
Right.
2007. And so the company, the ratings weren't great at the time due to probably a myriad of reasons, especially seeing as you've got a country station in your own company, which is pretty unorthodox to be kind of competing against yourself. But that's just how
the cannibalism going on.
Exactly. But we're all, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, our company based around, in the general landscape of Canada is a little bit different, being still sort of independent. And so my job was then to be the producer for the new radio station that had yet to be named. We had brought in a program director who had made his name in the rock format in both Edmonton and Regina. And they were going to call it the Bull. They finally told me that. And they basically said that they would like me to be the morning show producer. I'd come in a little bit earlier, and I would essentially work in the side studio and put bits together, be creative for a morning show. Because they were kind of adopting that morning zoo format, which hadn't really been done in our building, like 4 people on the morning show, just a wacky bunch of craziness that went on. And so that was going to be my job. And so the program director, a man by the name of Steve, he then met me in my office to talk about what my job was going to be from a production standpoint. Then he left my office. So about 2 hours later, he walked in and he said, "Do you want to be my evening DJ?" And I told him to F off, actually. And I didn't mean to. It seemed kind of rude on my part, but I was so taken aback by it because I wouldn't even have voiced my own commercials at the time. I hated the sound of my own voice.
Right.
And so what ultimately happened?
What evolved your perspective now? Because obviously those days are gone. You must enjoy the sound of your own voice to some degree.
I still cringe when I hear it on like a morning show promo or when I hear it online, because naturally, like people, like I always have to tell people that when they're like being interviewed for the first time on my show, I'm always like, nobody likes the sound of their own voice. And I know there's a scientific reason behind that, something about the bass or something compared to what you think you're hearing compared to what other people hear.
Right.
But I resisted the job offer for a while because I was in my first really long-term relationship at the time too. We had a very simple 9-to-5 thing going on, and I wouldn't call it whatever the positive version of a rut is. I felt like I was in it, and I didn't dislike it, but it wasn't really. I guess I was kind of getting into a rut now that I'm saying it out loud. And so
you knew you weren't rising to the full challenge of your capability and potential, but you enjoyed where you were.
Yes, I did. And at that time too, I also had I didn't have a lot of self-awareness, so I didn't really know even what I was ultimately capable of. And so what ultimately happened was he, over the course of about 2 days of a very hard sell, he probably took some advice from our sales department. He convinced me to give it a shot, to be his evening DJ. He wanted somebody young, and he wanted somebody who didn't have a lot of experience, who didn't have the broadcasting school traits, many of which are good, but a lot of times certain broadcasting schools in this contemporary era, you often have to unlearn some things from a student when they've been there, because some things they're taught are, they're a little old school, and they don't really apply with the current landscape.
Yeah, it's a fast moving medium. And so when you've got a prof in broadcast journalism who's teaching you how things were done when he or she or they were in the business, it was maybe 10 years ago, and the business evolved and it evolves quickly, right? So I totally understand that. So you never had any broadcast journalism experience at all. You never went to school for that.
I did not. Nope. I grew up around radio, and what I then did once I decided to accept the job was they put me into what they referred to as special high intensity training, or SHIT for short. I believe that's a Vic Dubois invention. You can credit that to him.
Suitable for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that was a learning experience because we basically did it in one of our side studios, in a voice tracking studio, and they wanted to essentially teach me a very basic communication skills as far as projecting, as far as speaking in an arc and always going down, and how to, what was the one big one? How to talk louder without increasing your volume. How to project a little bit more while not just screaming at someone. And so we had this genius idea that my dad should be the first one to teach me, which lasted a day, because it turns out when it's family, he has way less patience than a regular manager would. And I was far too sensitive to his criticism to make that work. We just kind of got really irritated, and I didn't want to do it. And then it ended up being one of our DJs on Magic 98, combined with my, at the time, new boss, Steve, who launched the Bull, who they taught me over the course of about 2 weeks. They just walked me through what it was like to be a radio DJ, and then they threw me on the air. The good part for me was that I had spent the last 6 years, even in high school, I was the sports broadcast operator at the radio station. That was my first taste of making any money. And I essentially sat there and pressed the button for a commercial when our guy would go to commercial, and roll that and record some of his big plays. And that was it. So I knew my way around a radio studio and a soundboard, and I knew the technicalities of it. So that did help me a little bit.
That's a core ethos of the 4-H program. If you've interacted with people who have an agricultural background, they're all quite familiar with 4-H, and it's learn to do by doing. And I don't recommend it for heart surgeons, but I think in the case of radio or sales, or even what I do in the concert business, or artists particularly, and that's where I find that your story aligns very, very much so with artists. A lot of times you talk to them and they're like, when I picked up a guitar or I sat and I wrote lyrics, the time just flew by. It felt like I wasn't working. It felt like I was doing something that was calling to a higher purpose within myself. And yet they find themselves, despite that desire and that love for what they're doing, forced into the business side of it. And then they've got to pick up what they can along the way. So I think your story is very relatable for a lot of people. It's like, you didn't necessarily want to get into the business that your parents were in. Probably some of that, and I'd be curious to hear, were you worried about judgments of nepotism or anything like that in the early days, especially?
Yes, very much so. I was worried about that. Even in high school, growing up, radio is a weird thing, especially when you grow up in the 90s and you have a family that's in it, because you have this people, and especially in a city like Saskatoon, that, you've been here so many times, but it is the biggest small town.
Yeah.
Right. And so we have the perks of a big city, but we have kind of the mentality of a small town. And so even growing up, for example, they always thought my family was the rich family. They always said that I was the rich kid, and I wasn't. Like, my dad was, he ended up getting a lot more successful as I got into my late teens. But growing up, we were just like any other family, but people knew him and people knew his voice. And at the time, social media wasn't a thing, and we don't exactly have, movie stars or anything in Saskatoon. And so, I'm probably going to say something that's a bit mean to him right now, but that's about what you got for a local celebrity at the time. Right. And so people they made that connection, and classmates and oftentimes their parents would make that connection. Like, they would invite us to birthday parties thinking we would bring bigger presents. And what they ended up getting was a mug from the radio station, because my family's actually kind of frugal. And so there was always this, growing up, even from a really young age. And then as I grew up, there was this shadow of the family that I think I was terrified of. And that's probably one of the reasons that, especially in high school, I genuinely didn't want to get into that field.
I think there's a preconceived bias or an intrinsic bias that all of us have that equates some level of fame, even if it's just more than what we have, with money. We assume that because people are more prolific than we are, that they're in a better situation financially. And there's a lot of times where that just ain't the truth. Like that is not necessarily the way it is. Yeah.
And the music industry too. I mean, that more than, that with all the artists and stuff that everybody thinks that if you're on a stage at, anything bigger than a PBR cabaret in Canada, there's a large group of people who think that you're just rolling in it. Yeah.
You're a multi-millionaire, and they don't understand that there are a lot of costs to doing business and being engaged in that business. And it's a high overhead game. When you get to the level of a George Canyon or a Brett Kissel, you're making a lot of money, but you are also paying a lot of bills. And for your dad as well, being an entrepreneur, he's making a lot of money, but he's paying a lot of bills. He's got a lot of overhead, a lot of people he's responsible for. And that's another interesting dynamic that you would have grown up with. You have a mom who's very prolific in civic service and civic duty. Your dad is like you say, a local celebrity. And you had to grow up and find your own way of entrenching your own personal brand, even though there were some large shadows cast around you and your immediate family.
There certainly was. And, we weren't, it was and I obviously don't, I'm not saying this to be, criticizing my family or anything like that. They've sacrificed so much, to give my sister and myself, a very good upbringing. But, a large part of that too was my dad for those really key years of his career when things really went up for him. He wasn't really around. He at one point was in Saskatoon for a couple of days of the week if he was lucky, but he was in either Regina or Edmonton or Winnipeg because he was managing a whole, it was called Four Best Broadcasting at the time. And he was managing a bunch of radio stations then too. And my mom being someone who, she never was a stay-at-home mom. She was always out there working and stuff too. So, what I got a lot of growing up was, I was in a lot of daycares and a lot of like babysitters and stuff. And so people just created their opinions about my family because they weren't ever around. And so that whole mystery added to them thinking that we were, bigger than we were, which made me a little more insecure. And it kind of just became this circle of life, but not in the best way from a mental health perspective.
No, I think one of the biggest injustices we can impose on each other is to judge and label rather than seek to understand and get the real backstory on where people come from and what insecurities and issues that they're dealing with and wrestling with at any given time in their life, or maybe they have in their past, or they are currently, or they will in the future. And, it breaks down our ability to act human among humans, and it's heartbreaking because in the forms you're talking about it usually manifests in bullying, right? Kids assume that because your dad has a bit of a profile locally, you must be rich and you must be this and you must be that. And you've had a spoon-fed career. And, none of those things are true if they took 5 minutes to actually get to know you.
You're right. And there was bullying too. That didn't last as long as I thought. I had a really early growth spurt. So by the time, like late elementary school happened, I had a foot on almost all my classmates. So that helped me in the bullying department because one kid went a little bit too far, and that was sort of that. We got a little talking to in our Catholic school and we moved on.
Well, but bullies generally, being a bully isn't necessarily synonymous with being courageous. In fact, it's usually the opposite. So most bullies are not looking to pick on people bigger than they are.
No, and this one was to make a point, and then we kind of moved on from there. But yeah, there was certainly the reputation, I guess, of the family really affected me growing up to the point where when I got older and I got into high school, I really did I almost did anything I could mentally to tell myself that I don't want to do radio. I wanted to be in a movie. I wanted to be a movie star at one point. I was in one movie ever, and it was a Disney movie that came to it was in Saskatoon. I auditioned on a whim and I ended up getting the part. And so from about 2 years after that, I thought that I was going to be some big Hollywood movie star. That was
what movie was it?
It's called The Impossible Elephant. It was. It doesn't really have anyone you know. I don't think. It's not really the A-listers, but it was about a flying elephant, not Dumbo, but similar to that.
Another flying elephant. Okay.
Another kind of flying elephant. Yeah. So that was fun for me. But that was one of those. I was basically doing anything I could to just dip my toe into other areas of interest to see if something grabs me.
So as it pertains to where things are now on the landscape of radio, and what we're seeing a lot of is consolidation, seeing a lot of these big chains like Rogers swallowing up a lot of these independent stations over the years. You guys have maintained independence in the face of that. What advantages and competitive advantages do you believe it affords you to retain independence in an age of consolidation?
It's a really good question. Freedom, I think, and obviously you can break that down, but that is, I think, the biggest part. And by freedom, I mean freedom to make decisions, for example, without having to run every single thing you're doing up a corporate chain. Freedom to know that when I go to work tomorrow, I won't be potentially let go because numbers didn't look right across the country. That's the biggest one. That's the biggest one for myself, but also for my staff and my colleagues too. That's one of the things that they love the most about it, is that there's a level of comfort almost.
Does that parlay as well into your ability to roll the dice and take a chance on artists who may not be making an impression nationally, but sometimes you've just got a gut feel about something, and so you want to believe in it, you want to support it, and therefore you add the songs? Like, does it go that far?
At times it does. Yep. In fact, I think for the Bull, that's where I found my wheels when it came to the on air and then programming standpoint, because basically from 2007, when the Bull launched, when I started on evenings, there was a very quick ascension there, not because I don't think I did anything inherently well, but I don't like giving myself credit for stuff, but we had someone leave. So all of a sudden I was a midday host. And then about 6 months later, we had our drive show host went to go be the morning show host on WW, when Steve Shannon, their old co-host, went to go run the hospital foundation. So Pat's the drive host, and they just kept shuffling me around. And then ultimately I was the music director, and I got the morning show in 2010. A lot of pressure, but I still felt like I was foreign to it all. I still felt like country music, the industry, and myself and radio, like we weren't there yet. I felt like I was holding my own okay, and from a music directing standpoint and an on-air standpoint, I was doing the best that I could. But I mean, to put it bluntly, I didn't love it. I didn't love it yet. I liked it, but I didn't love it. And then it was actually, like, to your point, it was in 2012 when Florida Georgia Line released Cruise that sort of made me find my footing that has led to sort of where I am today. And that was no country radio in Canada was playing it. We're talking like that song was released on YouTube, and there were a few stations in the States playing it. And it was a friend of mine, and I'll give him a shout out. His name's Kevin. He's just a guy I used to go for beers with from way back in the day. He was sitting with me once. We were out at a bar, and he said, "Have you heard this random song on YouTube?" And it was Florida Georgia Line's Cruise. And I listened to it, and I was like, that is very catchy. It's not, blowing anyone's mind with lyrical content or telling some big deep story, but there's something about that song that did something to my ears. And so the process of that was, I then went to my family's house, saw my father, and I was like, I have a question. And he said, what? I'm like, can I use a YouTube ripping program to take this song off of YouTube and start playing it on the Bull? And he had to hear it first. And so when he did hear it, he then he listened to it, and he said that he loved how it sounded. And did I lose you here? I feel like I've lost you.
Sorry, I lost you there for a second.
Yes, I was going to say you sort of.
We can just fix that in the editing. That's not a big deal. But
I'm going to pick up where I left off.
Sorry, go on. So you were talking a little bit about how you discovered FGL, and you went and talked to Vic about potentially adding the single, even though it was really just proliferated on YouTube at the time.
Yeah, and that was it. And he listened to it. I played it on his Apple TV, his old school Apple TV on our downstairs television, and he heard it and he thought that's pretty catchy. And his whole mentality with me, as the program, well, now as the program director, but at the time as the music director or the staff member, was always, he's not going to micromanage me. He's not also going to push for promotions or anything like that. I have to do that work myself. And so his thing with that was, you can certainly play it. And, if, you're going to accept the consequences if it ultimately doesn't work out, or if it fails. And so what ends up happening there is he then goes and, he lets me, I go to work. I use this kind of sketchy program to pull it off YouTube. And I started playing it on the Bull, and it became my most requested song in a couple of days. And then over the next few weeks, we are starting to see it get officially serviced to us. All of a sudden, every station in Canada eventually is playing it. But that was where I had sort of taken my first chance on the station and on a particular song based on a gut feeling and, trusting my instincts of what a good song sounds like. And I mean, I'm not crediting any of their success to what we did, but they ended up MacGyvering this little Western Canadian tour at the end of 2012 that hit like 4 stops, and one of them was us. TCU Place. It was sold out in like a minute. Totally not the venue really for a band like that where you're going to have a ton of dancing. But they, it ultimately worked out, and people in this city started to sort of know me for that, for better or for worse. There are some very traditional country fans who aren't exactly pleased with the fact that, I helped introduce what was at the time referred to as, I guess, bro country to the market.
Yeah, I mean, we can always quibble about the lyrical content of FGL, but you can't disrespect them from a business perspective. I mean, they went to every major label in Nashville, and they were passed on. Themselves and their management team took a step back. They decided to independently release Cruise, which became the most downloaded, streamed, and sold country song of all time. I worked with them on the very first arena tour that we did across Canada with FGL, and loved working with the guys and found them to be very humble and reasonable. But they told me the whole story, and they said, listen, like, nobody got us. Nobody believed us. We had to believe in ourselves much more than the marketplace did. And at the end of the day, they ended up getting the exact deal they wanted from Big Machine and Scott Borchetta on one of his sub labels, I believe, at the time. But that belief in the fact that they knew that they were on the right, or they were on the vanguard of this movement that had started maybe with Luke Bryan with a song like Country Girl Shake It For Me, which came out a little bit earlier, but they were on the vanguard of that movement of bro country, whatever you want to call it. But it became another bubble in the format, and they have stood the test of time and lasted beyond that now. So that does speak to legacy beyond just having one catchy song that makes you a one-hit wonder. They're definitely not that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's to that point now where there's such prolific songwriters with music that isn't even theirs. When I'll hear a song, I won't even look at the writing credits. I'm a verse into it, and I go, "Oh, that's absolutely a Tyler Hubbard cut." And sure enough, he's the lead writer on it. He has a very distinct style.
Yeah, it's interesting how you can start to recognize those patterns over time, right? And and then, like you say, like you actually diagnose them before you even read the composers or the writers, and you're in the know. What do you say to the people who feel like bro country has taken away from the format? People who take more of a traditional stance on the format. I mean, at some point, you've got to address their concerns too. And how do you do that?
From like a programming standpoint, or personal, just kind of both, because
I'd say both.
Yeah. Okay. My whole philosophy on that is, it's evolved, that's for sure. But I see it as sort of cyclical. I saw that, I mean, I was at the tail end of it. I was really young, but I know that the same thing happened with Shania and Garth when that style of country, in the late 80s and the early 90s really took over. And I guess the way that I became a little bit, when it came to the criticisms of bro country and what it's done, I became very numb to those kind of criticisms earlier because I'm a huge Johnny Cash guy as far as classic country artists. Like I'm a huge fan of Waylon and Hank, but Johnny Cash was always mine. The same reason why Eric Church is my favorite country artist currently. It's that outlaw vibe that isn't just like, look at me, I'm a badass, but like outlaw in more subtle ways. And so I remember when reading about, I was alive, but when Johnny Cash came onto the scene, he was received similarly too. He was this outsider who was changing things up and people didn't like it. And he got a lot of pushback from the more traditional fans. And so when Florida Georgia Line and that whole movement kind of happened, I probably responded to criticism to it a little bit more hostily than maybe I should, at least at the time, because I basically was like, music changes, deal with it kind of thing. But as time's gone on too, I realized that, the criticism, some of them, the reasonable ones they had a good point. They had merit. Country music as a format, and I guess you would know this, more than me. It is people have ownership over. Country fans feel an ownership to that type of music. It's theirs, and they feel this sort of companionship to it, and that can run very, very deep. And people who have criticisms about the state of it shouldn't be, written off.
It's lyrically driven, which means it appeals to emotions, which means that it's personal.
Absolutely. And the Florida Georgia Line.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, with Florida Georgia Line too, they were one where very early into their career too, they released Dirt, and they released these songs that were very well written, and they clearly came from a more traditional country perspective. And so I'm not a big fan of when people will put an artist or something into a box and or judge them off of a single. I mean, Megan Patrick is one of my favorite artists in Canada, as far as country artists in general, but especially women. And she's got some of the best written songs I've heard in many, many years. But it's funny, you think back, like her first single was Bow Chicka Wow Wow. And if you judged her entirely off of that song and its lyrical content, you would not get a very accurate picture of who she is.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. Absolutely. And it's transferable. You're right. Like an artist is the breadth and depth of their work. And that's what should define them, more so than just one particular song that makes it easy to define them, or write them off. I just think one of the best things about the bro country movement, if we're going to talk about the upsides of it, and we should, is the fact that it did draw new listeners into the format. And as I said to a number of my friends who I have empathy for, who are more traditional country fans, and they love George Strait and Alan Jackson and Dwight Yoakam, I said, yeah, listen, that's great, but every few years, country music needs a bubble. And it needs a bubble so that we can draw more listeners in, make it a bit more broad-based in terms of its appeal. And then, eventually, even though the popularity may wane to some degree, we're still playing with a larger pie of demographic than we ever were before. And that net effect overall is good for the business. And if you're in the business, or even if you're a fan and you're interested in seeing the format survive, then you have to give props to some of these bubbles within the format that do create a level of curiosity, a level of loyalty, and bring people in from the outside. Garth did it. Shania did it. Prior to those two, in the late 90s, I'm a lot older than you are. So I remember as a fan listening to Clint Black and Randy Travis, and even Alan Jackson was starting to come out in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was like there was this new energy around the format that just hadn't been there for years. And a lot of my buddies in high school who would tease me when I pull up in my truck listening to George Strait and they were listening to AC/DC, all of a sudden now I would hear them listening to some George Strait or some Alan Jackson or Dwight Yoakam, or even some of the more obscure artists from that time period who were big in the time, like McBride and the Ride or Little Texas. And it was like, okay, now you guys get the appeal. Now you understand why country music has so many qualities about it that are redeeming. And I just think anytime that happens, it's a positive for the business. And so we need it to happen every now and then. And it doesn't mean that every time it does happen, that every time there is a bubble, that you're necessarily going to feel like you can go along with the trend at that particular time.
Oh, absolutely. And it's such amazing points too. And that kind of leads into my whole philosophy of how country to me is the most exciting musical genre currently. And it, in my opinion, has been the most exciting one for the last 10 years because, you have so many influences and the amount of people that I know, like my high school, for example, I graduated in 2004 from high school. And because your story just really sparked this. Nobody listened to country at my high school, and we're more like the preppy Catholic school just down the road from where I currently live. But everybody was into rock, they were into hip hop, they were into pop. The country wasn't really cool at the time, at least where I was coming from. Whereas now, I had to do a speaking gig there about 6 months ago as an alum, and they wanted to do a country day. And 2/3 of the school decked out in country gear, which, as you know, nowadays country gear is a pair of Nike Dunks and a backward snapback, but they were still dressed for it. But they were all into it. They were asking about my favorite artists. They were saying they all listened to the station, and I attribute that to the last 10 years, whether it was bro country bringing people in. Now you have what I think they're referring to as boyfriend country, bro country with more like, just want to lay it down in some white satin sheets, the Dan and Shay kind of vibe too. And that, Dan and Shay they brought in so many people I know who spent most of their time listening to, The Weeknd, people like that. Now they're huge country fans, all because an artist like a Dan and Shay sort of introduced them to the genre.
Yeah. And one thing it does too, is it gives artists some creative license to be more expressive in a manner that feels authentic to them. I applaud you because you were one of the first stations that supported Corey Marks with Outlaws and Outsiders. And that song was a collaboration with Five Finger Death Punch, Ivan Moody, of course, the lead singer, Mick Mars from Motley Crue, and Travis Tritt. So it was an interesting and to some degree an odd pairing, but it works so well for that particular single. But one thing I've talked to Corey about personally is, even though the trend right now is pop country, it does, because that envelope has been pushed so far in that direction, it does give you the creative ability to feel a little bit more liberated, to put something out like Outlaws and Outsiders, which just wouldn't have found a home at all prior to the digital area, other than maybe purely on rock. But now country fans are starting to open their eyes, their ears, and their hearts to other influences outside the genre that actually affect the genre. Absolutely, they do. And you brought up a good point when you brought up the digital platforms too. I'm of the opinion that the advent of like digital streaming services isn't a bad thing for radio. I believe that it actually has helped out radio and has helped, and that we can work in tandem, because it allows artists like Corey, like that's such a good example. That song made me so happy when he released that, because it had everything that I loved. It had modern country sounds, of course, because I love the guy. It had Travis Tritt, who I grew up on. It had Ivan Moody as a person who, loves hard rock. It had, as an old school Crew fan, Mick Mars. Like it was everything that I wanted. And that would not have happened, I don't even think 10 years ago, because I don't think there would have been the justification to release it, because the market wouldn't have been there, but clearly it is. Yeah, it's interesting you say that about streaming, and I want to talk a little bit about that, because one of the narratives that I sometimes espouse, maybe to my detriment, is that one of the things I always loved about radio is this frontiersman-like spirit, where independent stations like yourself, who had a gut feel, could roll the dice on artists and therefore be on the vanguard of artist development, because that artist might get broken because of the attention they received on radio. And now what I'm seeing radio do is refer more to streaming data in order to justify positions on their playlists. And part of me I certainly understand the business logic of it. You'd be crazy if you didn't understand it. But there's a part of me that is a little heartbroken by that process, because I feel like radio has ceded the ground of artist development in terms of obtaining attention to the streaming platforms. And I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't know yet, but time will tell in the next 10 years whether or not, we're going to be crediting Spotify and Apple Music with breaking artists, much more so than radio stations such as yourself. And I'm not positive the net effect of that is good for radio as a whole.
That's a very good point. And yeah, my view on sort of the streaming versus radio, especially when it comes to breaking artists, it's kind of complicated in a sense. Like I do look at streaming numbers. I mean, trackers in radio certainly like to send them to me, so I definitely look through them in the emails, and it's an abundance of data, and I certainly reference them on the charts whenever looking to add music. But I think the reason why I like streaming existing is that it allows music to be more accessible to me from a programming standpoint. I'm a digger. I was a crate digger when it came to, I was big into, collecting records growing up. And so I like to go onto a Spotify or an Apple Music, or I don't know if people still use Tidal, but that was a little bit of an experiment. But I like to go and I like to dig and I like to find artists that, have they're in the 3, 4, maybe 5 figures in terms of monthly listeners, as opposed to the, in the hundreds of thousands or millions, and, use that as a platform to hear the song. And then at that point, maybe consider contacting the artist or simply just playing it off of Spotify on a computer. So
that's interesting. So you're using it as a tool to discover new artists, as opposed to a justification standard for adding artists.
Yep. And that actually, that comes from, back when the Bull first launched, it was the country rock station. That was how they wanted to distinguish us from the AM station that was pure country, allowing us to be a little bit more thinking outside the box. And as the music director, my job from my old boss was, you need to find songs that we can play that are like rock, but aren't so rock that they would be played on the local rock station, but have enough country. So basically my job at a very early age was to sort of sift through a lot of music. And so, I mean, I'll throw weird names out here.
Like, some of the artists that you were rolling the dice on, you're going to tell me that, which is perfect, because I'm curious about this.
Lenko, years ago, way before Greatest Love Story, they were putting out album after album, and we used to play them. I remember telling them that at Country Thunder a couple years ago, and they couldn't believe it. But what I was doing too was also not necessarily brand new artists when it came to the rock stuff. I was just trying to find anything we could play. Do you know Webb Wilder, Human Cannonball? Does that sound familiar to you?
I don't.
He is a I'm forgetting the name right now. I'm gonna, it's gonna be one of those things that Reverend Horton Heat.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So,
yeah,
kind of not exactly, but that there's this whole Texas country movement, right? Which was initiated, before these guys, but some of the early adopters of it were Pat Green, Charlie Robeson, who married Emily from the Dixie Chicks, probably his biggest claim to fame. And now you're seeing guys like Cody Jinks, Whiskey Myers, bands like that infuse a lot of pure rock sensibilities. And I'm talking about almost Hendrix level rock sensibilities into country music. And it's very edgy. It's very interesting. And I'm surprised that format as a whole hasn't found more success outside of the state of Texas, because the appeal is certainly there.
It certainly is. And I mean, you bring that up because I just saw on Twitter a couple of days ago that Parker got his #1 with Pretty Heart Funding. Now, granted, as far as his catalog and compared to the artists you just mentioned, that is one of the safer singles that he could have released. But I'm hoping, because I'm right there with you, I'm hoping that his initial success is going to open the doors for a lot more of that on radio, because I personally love that sound.
Yeah, Pat Green was almost there when he got the deal with Universal and he released Wave on Wave, which went #1, yep. But the rest of the album basically flopped. Jack Ingram's another great example of somebody in the early to mid 2000s who released, he did that cover of the Hinder song. What was it? Lips of an Angel?
And then he also had Love You, which was apparently what I was told. That wasn't supposed to mean love.
The original version of that song was Fuck You. And he changed it to Love You, altered the lyrics a little bit to align with that, but still had the tongue-in-cheek feel to it. And I agree. I mean, I think that every once in a while there are those outliers that express themselves boldly on the very fringes of our format, but they're the ones who move the vanguard forward. They're the ones who challenge sort of the traditional country institutions. And for me, that's exciting. And I think it can come from a number of different angles. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing when Sam Hunt releases a pop flavored country single. But I also think it's a great thing when somebody like Corey Marks comes along and releases something like Outlaws and Outsiders. It just punches you in the face, and it's not pop at all, but it pushes the edges of the format out a little bit and redefines what's acceptable.
100%. And that's what I love. Is I love the people who kind of push the edges out, because you notice in radio, at least I have, that especially in Canada, you have a lot of like, not fringe, that's the wrong word. You have a lot of niche, if you want to call them that, rock stations. You know, you've got your classic rock station, your alt rock, your modern rock. With country, unless you're in a massive market, like a really big city in Canada or in the States, you have country stations for the most part. Every once in a while, you'll have like your traditional country station, or obviously AM certainly, you know, leans towards the classics, but country is just always evolving, and it's only it's only the single format, and I find that to be very exciting, which is one of the reasons why kind of my whole programming philosophy with the Bull was something called Your Country, was telling people that what they were hearing is theirs, regardless of whether it's a sound they're familiar with or a sound that they're going to be familiar with over the coming
or a
years.
sound that they could take ownership of for 3 minutes and 19 seconds, you know, like that the format was theirs overall, even if they didn't agree with every individual choice. Now, other than FGL, have you had some other indie success stories? And then I want to parlay that into a two-part question. So I want to hear about other people that you rolled the dice on, especially if they're Canadian, that you feel like you were able to get them some attention and optics. But also, moving forward, how you make your decisions on ads, especially as it pertains to indie artists. So how do you demarcate something that's worth taking a chance on versus something that isn't? And when you have taken a chance, how has, what are some success stories that you can speak to?
A good question. As far as, how, like, the sort of, I guess, philosophy on what to add or what not, or what to take a chance on, it's not really like something that's written in stone. I kind of almost have the things that and by me, I mean me personally, but also I'm speaking on behalf of the radio station and what I think it should sound like. I have what are called my turnoffs, I guess. You lose me really quick by presenting a single to me if you start the sentence with Canada's new Carrie Underwood or something. I'm not a big fan of that initial comparison to an already big artist. I want you to tell me about yourself and tell me about your sound from your perspective, not needing to say, like, if you like Luke Bryan, you're going to love this guy, that kind of a thing.
Right. I understand that from a marketing perspective, but I agree with you. I've had so many artists over the years come to me and say, listen, you should work with me. I'm like George Strait. I'm like, well, I would rather work with George Strait. Like, honestly, I want you to define yourself, in the terms that give you some sort of competitive edge in the marketplace, right? Like, rather than being forced to emulate so that you can give me a compartmentalization that might make me feel comfortable. Tell me about you. So it's interesting to hear that you follow that same mindset when you're hearing pitches.
Absolutely. Don't tell me who you're the same as. I want to know why you're different. That is my initial impression you make on me. The second one is production. That's not as big of a deal today as it was when I became the music director in around 2008. Production in terms of I call it the Keith Sakari principle. It's a very lame thing to say, but I tell that to my new music directors, and it's basically, will this song, sound and flow properly between a Keith Urban and a Carrie Underwood song? But at the same time, 2020, you can create well-produced hits using a vocal booth you set up in your kitchen and a laptop on your kitchen, or on your island if you want to. But for a while there, especially in the late 2000s when I first got into this, I became the music director. That was a big part of it. Like I had a very high standard when it came to just how things sort of sounded on the radio. Like production had to be there. And a lot of times production was really lacking in some people's songs. The lyrical quality was there and the talent was there, but it sounded like it was recorded from, inside someone's basement using an old USB microphone.
Right. Yeah, we've talked about the evolution of production on other podcasts. I had Annie Wilson on a few episodes ago, and she talked a lot about how, especially in the early 90s, late 80s, there was a massive difference between what you would hear in terms of Canadian country artists versus Americans, and most of that had to do with production value. Thankfully, that doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
Exactly. It's not. So that's something that, that makes my job a little bit easier, because I know if I'm getting something sent to me via DMDS, or if I'm finding it on Spotify while I'm digging, I know that it's gonna sound, it's been mixed and mastered properly to sound good on an FM signal, which, degrades the quality in and of itself. The other aspect of it too, for me, is I really look for sincerity. And I know that that's probably a cookie cutter answer, but
it's not cookie cutter, but it is subjective.
It is, exactly. Realism, being genuine. It's kind of like my political opinions, which we can get to at some other time. But I don't care if I disagree with you. I just want you to be you. I want you to be unapologetically you. And so in the case of, if I can talk about a couple of artists, I think the biggest one for me, and when I say this, I'm obviously not saying that I or even the Bull is fully responsible for these people's success. But people we took a chance on really early, Jess Moskaluk is the top of that list. Saskatchewan girl who, had an online reputation, but who didn't really have much of a footing in the country music industry. I didn't know who she was. I wasn't getting anything sent to me about her. A colleague of mine in a different city asked me if I'd be willing to give his friend's song a listen to, and it was Amen Hallelujah. I clicked it thinking it was going to be a gospel single based on the title. I just assumed that, and so my mind was already on we could maybe play it during gospel hour on our AM, but certainly not going to happen here. And then I clicked the video and I started listening to it, and this is super going to contradict my don't compare it to another artist thing I said. But my first thing was, holy crap, this is Carrie Underwood. This is yes. Canada's Carrie Underwood. Immediately, that's the first place my mind went. I'm like, this woman's got some ridiculous talent, and we need to get her on the radio.
Yeah, she's a great case. I'm glad you brought her up, because I know that you were one of the early believers as far as she's concerned too, and she's gone on to have platinum singles and win Junos, but that all starts somewhere. How much do you care about the business side of it? Like, if you stumble across an artist who's great, but they also have an A-level team behind them, that must to some degree factor into your decision-making process, because at least there's a better chance they're going to follow up their greatness with more greatness. Or at least you're not going to roll the dice, play a single, and the following year they're probably going to be out of the business. Like, does that matter to you when it's pitched to you with either a major label, a strong indie, maybe a management or agency affiliation that brings some level of gravitas to that artist beyond just the music itself?
Absolutely, it does. It completely does, because whether it's a label, whether it's management or anything like that, you have obviously seen something in that artist that has made you go, I'm willing to stake the reputation of the company. I'm willing to put my own money into this artist. So and I trust the talent around the industry. I came into country music and into radio sort of from an uncommon angle. And so I look up to people like, the Steve Codys of the world, the Jim Cressmans of the world, the Warren Kopniks of the world, people like that, because you guys have a ridiculous amount of experience, and you have impeccable taste. And so there's certainly, I give more mental energy, I guess, more credit to artists initially who do come from a major label or from a reputable source, because that artist has clearly done enough work to get your attention.
That's good to hear. And also, I think a good point for indies out there who are struggling to get attention at radio. You have to build your product to a point where it attracts the right type of business affiliates in order to be taken even more seriously. The art will speak for itself, but only to a degree. And I think it's good for people to know that. Now, if you've got the time, I would like to talk a little bit about what you've done in terms of social justice and some of your political instantiations, if you have the time to talk about that.
Absolutely. Why not?
Okay,
I like to
good.
talk about that
Well, you
stuff.
talked about you talked about pushing the boundaries within the format of country music, but you also have pushed the boundaries of what might you've been acceptable in terms of viewpoints by peers in the industry, in the country music industry. You've been very outspoken about your stance on and taken very heterodox opinions, I think, from the rest of the industry on some things, which takes a lot of courage. And I'm always interested to hear sort of the origin story. Like what situation was it where you were like, fuck it, I got to take a stand and I got to make the stand public? Where did that start?
Wow. That's a very good question. I've thought about that from time to time too, to narrow it down to a particular event. For me, it's more a particular kind of time frame, and it was the early part of the 2010s. Because I grew up in a very political family. My mom, as you mentioned earlier, she's been in civic politics for a very long time. My father, who is fairly apolitical, he'll MC the one provincial party's golf tournament on June 10th, and then the other competing parties one a week later. So he's been fairly apolitical and more of a centrist his whole life, which is great. Yeah, exactly. And so, and growing up, I was always told, you don't talk about politics. You never tell anybody who you vote for, and you don't talk about things like that. And growing up, and I'll say this now, I still, to a degree, consider myself a bit of a conservative, but growing up, politics seemed simpler. Growing up, I was told, liberals want to, they want to change things, whereas conservatives want things to essentially stay the same. They want to work hard, they want to save money, and they want you to be appreciative of what you have. And as a young Catholic kid in Saskatoon, that's very appealing to me. And I thought it was very simple. But then as time went on, it was really the fight around gay marriage in the United States, and to a lesser degree Canada, since that fight sort of occurred here and was settled on when I was still quite young. But watching what had happened in the United States and just seeing how much politics got involved in that specific angle. And I'm a straight white man, but I have so many friends who are LGBTQ, and to see so much time and effort and money and tax money which is everyone's going towards a cause like that, to just try to tell a group of people who pay the same taxes you do, who sacrifice everything that we do, that they are somehow less valued in our society than we are. It struck a really strong chord with me, and I think, based upon all of my soul searching, I can kind of really, pinpoint that fight as sort of my first step into having my own opinions, into standing for something publicly.
Well, that resonates with me a lot. I really hit the lottery growing up. My parents were farmers out in the middle of nowhere, Alberta. I was raised near Dunelda, Stettler, really a conservative heartland, but they were conscientious and compassionate conservatives. My parents, I still remember when I was I must have been 4 years old, asking my mom about how I could better understand someone who had a thick accent, and finding the way they talked uncommon. And as a kid, sometimes you find that even comical to a degree, right? And my mom laid down the law. She's like, listen, if somebody has an accent, that means they can speak more languages than you. That means there's something to be learned. That means they have an appreciation and understanding for a culture that maybe you've never been exposed to. And so when you hear someone with an accent, think less about how much they're struggling with English and appreciate the fact that they know another entire language and culture that you might not even be privy to. I'm paraphrasing my mom, obviously, but that was
an incredible woman.
Yeah, she didn't beat me down or make me feel guilty, but she just gave me that perspective, right? But she's a conservative. Like, and still to this day probably would be classified as one. So for me, I've struggled, especially in the last few years, of this sort of reclassification of these broad strokes, whether they're on the left or the right, because I do think the magic in human beings is in the nuance. It's in the details. It's in the backstories, right? And so it was the same thing with gay marriage. Like, from an early age, when that debate flared up in, the 80s, and even the most hardcore progressive liberals at the time were basically against it. My parents, who were conservatives, were like, I don't care, man. If you're lucky enough to find love in this lifetime, fucking go for it. Like, you're one of the few who actually gets to experience true love, and that happens to be somebody who has the same genitalia you do. Like, go for it. Like, it's not for me to say if it's something that's going to make you feel fulfilled. And so I do understand that type of conservative exists, because I've lived it. But for me, I see, unfair classifications on both sides, by the way, and I'm sensitive to them on both sides, because, I live in an industry and work in an industry that's very progressive, and I respect the desire to continually move the vanguard and continually push for social justice, for equality. I understand all of that. I also understand that there are people who want to stand up for certain institutions that they think have served humanity well in the long term. So I always find it difficult to reconcile those things when you're thrown into a Twitter battle, where it's 280 characters to sort of like sum up and sick burn somebody in the context of a tweet.
Yeah, social media has certainly been a catalyst to sort of the you mentioned the last few years, and how I was going to say battle lines. The lines have been sort of redrawn, and that is my basic political philosophy. I don't pretend to be a conservative or a liberal. I think that actually people who have been really embracing those terms in this day and age, it hurts the conversation more than helps it. The only thing I will admit that I am, if you want to title things, is, and this can be tough for some people, I am a populist. I consider myself more of a populist, because when the gay marriage thing happened, and when I got sort of politically active at the time, I kind of call myself a political hobbyist, similar, kind of like Joe Rogan, but with a few more convictions, with a little less open-mindedness and a few more convictions.
Fair enough. And that's based on what you've experienced up to this point too.
Exactly.
You've had a different life than Joe Rogan. You shouldn't see life the same way he does.
Exactly. But I respect the way he does it, because him and even Andrew Cuomo from CNN, I'm not a big CNN guy, but I really enjoy his disagree with decency perspective on things. And what I eventually learned after the gay marriage thing happened, and I started looking into the realm of what politics meant, Canada versus the United States, so many different things there, it occurred to me that the things that I was told growing up from my parents, when they'd say, you don't talk about politics, or whenever my dad would MC an event, there's always political jokes. Like, we got some politicians in the room, some little crack about, it's almost like we accepted as a society that politicians suck. And I don't think that that's right at all. I think that we fell into a trap.
No, but it's also not good to think that they're demagogues, right? Like you're right. We shouldn't look at politicians and people who are in public service with contempt, but we also shouldn't expect that they're going to be the savior for all our problems. That's not fair.
Exactly.
Either.
You look at them as people. You should. This is what I push for in sort of my life, I guess, and what I'm going to continue to push for is to just elect the right people who are there for the right reasons, people who are aware that they're getting paid a very nice six-figure salary of our money to enact what we want them to do. And I find that in this modern era, politicians on the left and on the right, have a vested interest in keeping us fighting about gay marriage, fighting about abortion, fighting on a couple of these very, very huge wedge issues culturally that take all of our attention away from the fact that not all of them, but many of them, especially this day and age, are coasting through that job They're just taking the money, doing very little work, and making economic decisions and policy decisions behind the scenes that hurt people who are taxpayers, while they're too busy arguing about whether or not a woman should be allowed to get an abortion.
Right. Yeah, you're seeing a lot of that right now with some of the regulations being imposed. I'm going to use Gavin Newsom because it's a great example right now. Here's a guy who's locked down the entire state of California. He's imposed major sanctions on small businesses in terms of what they can do and can't do. And, he's at French Laundry with 12 people, no masks, indoors, caught on tape, enjoying dinner. I mean, to me, that's the ultimate version of not only hypocrisy, but corruption. And I understand people are human, and I understand they make mistakes, and I've got empathy in my heart. I'm a human too. But as far as I'm concerned, if you are caught breaking the very regulations you've imposed on your entire populace, you should at the very least have to step down, but potentially face criminal charges as well.
I could not agree more. And I'll even add to that, Gavin Newsom, I'll even put somebody in there who's a little bit more well-known and people have a lot of passion for, and I'm probably going to make a couple of people angry when I say it, but Nancy Pelosi, I find, is the same way. And I use the United States as sort of a barometer for this, because here in Canada, and God bless us, we do have more than two parties. But when you're talking about the sort of left versus right, it's easy to use the United States with their two-party system. And there isn't that much of a difference. They want you to think that the Democrats and the Republicans are so completely on the opposite sides of each other. That might be the case for like a right-wing populist. I'm not having any that are coming to mind right now. And like on the left, like a Bernie Sanders or an AOC, but 90% of them are essentially the same. They want the same policies. We see that every time they vote on the military budget. It's horse shit.
Yep. Donald Trump is Hitler. Donald Trump is this and that. And then it's like, well, then why did you give him 3 arms? Why did you vote for that? Because if he's literally Hitler, you should not be voting in favor of a multi-billion-dollar military budget for him to use at his discretion. Like that's where, again, I think those of us who are willing to not put on a jersey for one team or the other and retain our ability to maintain some critical thought, we can look at a situation and go, well, hold on a second. What are you saying to get attention? And what's your real conviction? Because if you believe that Donald Trump is all of these things, and many of those things I believe he is too, but if you think he is all of those things, why in God's name would you give him all this money to spend on military armaments? Like, that obviously is a bad idea.
Yep, and for most people, it's because they're on their team, and that's corruption is corruption as far as I'm concerned. And you look at what just happened in the United States. I get very worked up, and I get very passionate about the way that COVID relief has taken place in the United States. And if you look at what Nancy Pelosi did before the election, how she had the opportunity, and I'm putting this on her because she ultimately speaks for the House. She had the opportunity to provide the hardest working and hardest hit Americans with less relief than they deserve, but something. And she refused to do it because she thought that it was going to make Trump look too good before the election and could potentially give him the win.
Right. And that's disgusting.
That's unconscionable as far as I'm concerned. That is playing politics in the most stereotypical sense. And it's the thing that I am trying to work to get that mentality out of politics. At the end of the day, you're serving the people. And I think that you can be on the right or the left, and we can agree on that we should have less corruption and more of our will being passed to an extent. Even if, there's people in this world who I disagree with certain things culturally, but if the vast majority of people disagree with me and they elect people who disagree with me, and that person enacts the policy I disagree with, the people wished it. They willed it and they got what they wanted. I just want the people to get what they want more on either side of the political spectrum.
Yeah, in the U.S., another hot button issue is Medicare for all, right? 87% of Democrats want government-funded Medicare for all. I believe it's 78% of Republicans, although I should check that stat. I'm kind of talking out of my ass, but
I've heard that number too.
Somewhere in that realm. And so let's just say it's 80%. Well, then why the hell don't you have it? The people obviously want it. I mean, the reason that it doesn't exist is because somewhere in those internal discussions that none of us are privy to, well, they're making us fight over bullshit issues half the time. They're making these decisions in private and choosing not to support a bill that overwhelmingly has the support of the American public. And again, that's playing politics. That's disgusting. That's ideological possession as far as I'm concerned, where it's like, we're not going to give the other team a win on this just because we don't want to allow them the benefit of the legacy. And in fact, we will hurt the people we are working for and our fiduciary responsibility is with in order to play politics. And I don't care if you're on the left or the right, you do that, you've lost me.
I couldn't agree more. It's lost me as well. And I mean, it happens within the parties too. I mean, the left is notoriously bad for that. You know, it seemed like it would be a slam dunk for the Democrats in the United States to secure themselves a foothold in either the presidency and Congress if they were to pass something like Medicare for all, because as you just said, and I believe that 70% number is correct, because I've heard that too, that it's such an overwhelmingly popular and bipartisan. It doesn't matter how old you are, whether you live in, Mississippi or California, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, or you're a man or a woman, the majority of people in the States, they do want that. But even within the Democratic side of things, you got a person like a Bernie Sanders and his ilk who are pushing it. A lot of people don't vote for it because they don't particularly like Bernie as a person, which I understand. Or more than anything,
what did you think of the treatment of Bernie by the corporate press during the primary?
It was horrific. And that's actually one of my major sort of political, I guess, stances when it comes to the United States and politics in general is, the Democrats and the corporate establishment. I really hate the word establishment. I find that it gets overused, but it is a real thing. The Democrats are so beholden to that structure that has existed down there since, you could say the late 70s and 80s with like Nixon and Reagan, but they're all beholden to the insurance companies. And so Joe Biden, God bless him, I hope he does well, but he even admitted that he'll veto, even if the Congress and the Senate both pass a Medicare for all bill, it hits his desk, he's vetoing it because they're too ingrained with the for-profit insurance companies, and it would take too much of a radical shift to their system, in their opinion, to ever make that change actually happen.
And they've accepted too much money from those companies.
They certainly have. And so what has to happen next, that down there, we have our own issues up here, obviously, but in the States, my guess is that it's going to go far enough soon that you're going to have an implosion. I don't know what is going to happen with it, but you're going to get some type of a legislation and movement similar to the New Deal back in the 1930s and the 1940s. But at that point, you had the Great Depression, you had World War II that were sort of the catalyst for those. We can't have another world war now to spur that on. We wouldn't exist. And so I don't know what is going to push America to that brink. And thus with Canada too. We have sort of similar problems to the States, but they're a bit different. But I figure that whatever happens down there often ripples up here, and we'd be ignorant to pretend that it doesn't.
Let's talk a little bit about the ability to shape and change popular opinion through social media, because as much as I see it as an effective communication tool, I choose not to debate politics or really anything that's too sensitive on there, because I feel like I've always said this. This is just I think it's really important to talk about things that are uncomfortable to talk about. But I think sometimes when you are doing it in, say, the format of Twitter, and it's happening in front of a bunch of people, it's happening in front of an audience. It's a little bit like getting in an argument with a guy at the bar and there's 30 people watching and you feel like you need to save face because you're on public display, as opposed to how you might work that out with that individual if you two were in private talking, right? And so I'm not a big fan of changing minds by arguing with people on Twitter or Facebook myself. Now, you've been able to do that quite effectively, but do you feel like the platform affords the ability for you to express the nuances in such a articulate capacity, which you've just been doing the past 10 minutes? Don't you think the platforms actually confine your ability to connect and express nuance, as opposed to end up playing to the audience?
Absolutely. Social media has been a blessing, but it's a curse in that department. Twitter is the worst because you mentioned you have an actual character limit, and I've never been a big tweeter because I'm a wordy guy. I've always, even though I'd be considered a little bit younger, I am still a Facebooker by nature because you can write as much as you want on there. But I think that social media, and I think that social media, as far as how it's run as a business and how politicians use it, they benefit from getting rid of as much nuance as possible in a debate, because debate in this day and age, and you've probably observed this, and I'm guessing it's one of the reasons why you don't engage in certain debates online, is that debate has changed. Debate, when I grew up and what I was taught in school, in debate class, was that it was about a sharing of ideas and letting the audience go away with new information they didn't have before, and the ability to sort of create their opinion based on that and potentially have their opinions changed. Nowadays, a debate isn't won by the person who has, who states the most factually correct things. It's the person who is the loudest. It's the person who says what they're saying with more conviction than the other person, even if it's completely wrong. You see a lot of that with the science or the anti-science based debates that often prop up when it comes to COVID-19. And I find that can be a serious detriment to it. I've tried to harness it in some ways to create, a positive dialogue often, but I mean, and you bear witness it multiple times. It takes so little for it to just completely, unravel and to just basically go off the rails into just, my 5 talking points, your 5 talking points, who can dunk on each other the most and walk away feeling like they just, they just dragged someone publicly. And I don't think that that's healthy.
There's some utility to it. I mean, it does make you really think through your perspectives and arguments, because now they are not only fodder for the individual you're debating, but anybody else who might be privy to the conversation that's happening in public, right? So I know in my case, I've tried to use that to my advantage when I'm not sure how I feel about something, because maybe I haven't entertained all of the variables or considered all the factors, or the case with many of us, including myself, I've become ideologically possessed. I've memorized the talking points, and now I think that's my perspective. But it's not. When I actually take it into the real world and try and debate it and defend it, it's like, okay, actually now I see some holes in my argument. The problem is connecting with the humility it takes to be self-aware enough and to publicly take your licks, as they would say, right? Like a lot of people just don't have the ability. They have the ability to, they're open enough to be educated, but they don't want to be educated in a forum where they're being potentially lectured to or condescended to. And that's one of the reasons why I've kind of abandoned it. It's like, there's no way I can speak to you, I don't think, in front of a bunch of people, especially if I disagree with you, where I'm going to force you into a corner, right? Like,
yeah.
If I really believe in my convictions and I've thought this issue through and I've steel-manned the other side of it, so that I really building straw man, which is another terrible habit, but I've steel-manned the other side of the argument, and I know it through and through. I know it's very hard for anybody, including myself, to say in a public forum, you know what, you're right, you just shifted my perspective.
It's a shame thing too.
That's one of the downfalls of it. Right.
Well, exactly. People don't want to be wrong.
Yeah, it's one of the downfalls of public debate in that forum. No, and I don't blame them. I have the same proclivity to, not want to take my licks in public.
I'm the same way too. I think one of the things that has weirdly helped me, and I don't know why I'm admitting this, but is the same philosophy that I almost put towards, when I'm on the radio and when I want to crack jokes and I know I'm going to get people who are going to be, disliking me, even way before I had sort of any public political or social justice opinions. It was just me on the radio. You don't like taking criticism and you don't like opening yourself up to it. And so I always take I admit when I'm wrong publicly a lot, because I think that it shows a level of sincerity. But B, I think that it shows people that, well, it kind of takes away people's ability to sort of hit you on certain things. And I got that from Eminem, from how he does his battle rapping, honestly. Because if you listen to any Eminem diss track, the first half of it is him just shitting on himself, just taking every piece of him, everything that he knows that is a shortcoming of him. He will dunk on himself repeatedly before opening up to the guy he's taking on, which really sort of uses up all of the arrows in the opponent's quiver, because it's not
a
fun to
preemptive strike.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's, I mean, granted, I also, admit when I'm wrong, just because I think that that's the adult thing to do. But I'm also very bad for trying as long as I can not to, because there's an ego involved with everyone to a degree. And it all comes to play in social media, in the bubbles they put you in and you get in your little echo chambers, people get so riled up, and the jury's still out on how I feel about it as a whole.
Yeah, it's funny. It's I think that the only thing that is threatening is the potential that you might learn a new perspective, and that should not be threatening at all. I understand how it can be uncomfortable when it happens in a public domain, but I love. Listen, I'm talking to crazy people. It's not the reason I have you on the podcast, by the way. But I love talking to people on all sides of the political spectrum, because I think it's really interesting to develop an understanding as to where